The offer arrived at 4 in the afternoon, carried by a woman whose shoes cost more than his monthly rent. She told him the yacht sailed at 9, and if he signed the clearance, his shop's debts would vanish by morning. Silas Warren was a single father who repaired boats other mechanics rushed past, and that habit was about to cost him everything. He did not promise to sign. He simply picked up his tool bag and followed her to the dock. Silas Warren's shop sat on the windward edge of Barrow Harbor, where the working boats outnumbered the pleasure craft by 4-1. The building was a converted cannery warehouse with a roll-up door that shuttered when the tide was high and the wind came from the northeast. Inside, the concrete floor sloped gently toward a central drain that had been installed in the 1970s and had never quite worked the way the original builders intended. The walls held every tool Silas had acquired across 17 years of working on vessels that other people had already given up on. He woke at 5:30 every morning without an alarm. The first sound in the house was the coffee grinder, then the kettle, then 3 quiet knocks on the door at the end of the hallway. Nora answered them the same way each day. A small groan, the shuffle of feet, and then the door opening to reveal a 6-year-old with tangled hair and serious eyes that matched her mother's. Their house on Mill Street was a single story with a narrow porch and a kitchen that still had the linoleum Silas had promised to replace 2 winters ago. He had not replaced it, but had simply learned where the seams had begun to lift, and he walked around them. By 6:15 they were in the truck, Nora's lunchbox between them on the bench seat, and by 6:30 Silas was unlocking the shop's side door with a key that stuck on the second turn. The harbor at that hour held a particular quality of light that made the water look like something you could measure rather than something you could drown in. Silas had spent enough time below the waterline to know that this was an illusion, but he still appreciated the way the morning made the boats appear honest. His reputation in Barrow Harbor was not loud. It did not travel by advertisement or by the postcards at the marina office. It traveled by the particular silence that followed a bad job. When another mechanic's shortcut revealed itself 3 miles offshore, Silas did not advertise the mistakes of his competitors. He simply did not make them. He measured keel bolt torque with a wrench he calibrated himself every spring, and he traced stress fractures with a dental pick he had bought at a pharmacy because it was finer than anything at the marine supply store. He replaced fasteners that looked fine to the untrained eye because he had learned that corrosion begins beneath the paint line, in a geometry too small to see without leaning in close. This thoroughness cost him money. A hull survey that another mechanic could complete in 90 minutes took Silas 3 hours. He wrote reports that described not just what he had found, but what he had looked for and why it mattered. Customers who wanted a quick signature did not return after their first visit. Customers who had nearly lost a boat to a through-hull fitting installed with the wrong thread sealant found him again and again. The shop was not failing, but it was not thriving. The ledger stayed balanced through repeat customers, a harbor master's contract, and the occasional weekend job that Silas took because the vessel interested him. Nora knew the shop's rhythms better than she knew the rules of the playground at her school. She understood that the hydraulic lift made a sound like a sigh when it settled, and that her father's silence after tapping a hull 3 times meant he had found something the rest of the world had decided to ignore. On the afternoon the offer arrived, she sat at the desk near the front window, working through a spelling worksheet that required her to use the words boat float and trust in complete sentences. She had finished boat and float and was considering trust when the door opened without a knock. The woman who entered wore a coat that looked as though it had never been worn in weather and shoes with heels that struck the concrete floor with a sound unlike any footwear Silas had ever heard in his shop. Behind her stood a man in a uniform that identified him as a captain. He carried a leather folio under one arm and did not look at the tools on the walls or the boat on the hardstand. He looked only at Silas and then at his watch. The woman introduced herself as Alara Voss. She did not extend her hand. She said that her yacht, the Meridian Star, had arrived in Barrow Harbor that morning and was scheduled to depart at 9 p.m. for a private event 12 miles offshore. She explained that the vessel required a local safety clearance certificate and that the marine surveyors she had contracted in the city had failed to meet her at the dock. She added that Silas's name had been mentioned by the harbor master as a mechanic who held the necessary certification and was available on short notice. Silas set down the torque wrench he had been holding. He asked when the vessel had last been in dry dock for a full hull survey. Alara looked at her captain, who answered that the Meridian Star had been hauled and inspected 4 months prior. Silas asked who had performed the inspection. The captain named a firm in Newport that Silas recognized as one of the larger corporate survey outfits on the coast. Silas asked to see the report. The captain opened the folio and produced a folder of paperwork that was thorough in its way. The certificates were current. The signatures were valid. The photographs showed a clean hull, a polished propeller, and a bilge that looked as though it had never held water. But the report was 4 months old, and Silas had learned that 4 months on a vessel of the size Alara described could mean anything. He told her that he would need to board the vessel and perform his own inspection before he could sign any clearance. Alara's expression did not change, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted by a fraction of an inch. She said that time was the one commodity she did not have. She said that the event offshore had been planned for 8 months, that guests were arriving by tender at 7:30, and that a delay would cost more than Silas's shop was worth. Then she made the offer. She named a figure that would clear the remaining balance on the shop's equipment loan, and she added a second figure that would cover operating expenses for 5 years. She did not raise her voice, and she did not make threats. She simply laid out the terms the way a person lays out a weather forecast, as something that was going to happen regardless of whether the listener found it pleasant. Nora had stopped writing. She was watching the interaction with the same serious eyes she used when her father tapped a hull 3 times and went silent. Silas noticed her attention, and he noticed that Alara noticed it too. Alara's gaze rested on Nora for a moment longer than was necessary, and then she mentioned that she served on the advisory board of the Harbor Development Committee. She mentioned that the committee was considering several applications for long-term commercial leases. She mentioned that a man with a child to support should think carefully about where he wanted to be standing in 5 years. Silas did not look at Nora. He did not want her to see the particular calculation that was moving behind his eyes. He told Alara that he would board the vessel at 6 p.m. and that he would complete his inspection by 8. He told her that he would sign the clearance if the vessel met the standards he applied to every hull he surveyed. He did not promise to sign. He simply agreed to look. At 5:45, Silas walked Nora to the neighbor's house 2 doors down from the shop, Mrs. Carver answered the door with the distracted kindness of a woman who had raised 3 children and was not intimidated by one more for an evening. Silas told Nora to finish her spelling worksheet and that he would be back by 9. Nora asked if he was going to fix the big boat. Silas said he was going to look at it. Nora considered this, and then she told him that looking was how fixing started. Silas did not argue with her logic. He simply nodded, handed Mrs. Carver the lunchbox Nora had forgotten on the truck seat, and walked back toward the marina with his tool bag in his hand. The Meridian Star was 92 feet at the waterline, and it loomed over the dock in a way that made the surrounding fishing boats look like models in a child's bathtub. Silas boarded through the service gangway at the stern, not the polished stairway that led down from the aft deck, where crew members in white shirts were arranging flowers in chrome vases. The engine room hummed with the low, expensive sound of a generator. The air inside smelled of ozone, leather, and the particular sweetness of a climate control system that had been running since the vessel left its berth. Captain Mercer met him in the companionway that ran forward from the engine room. He was a man in his 50s with the kind of tan that comes from years of reflected water rather than leisure, and he carried the ship's log in a folder of documentation that he handed to Silas without comment. Silas accepted the folders and asked to begin at the bow. Captain Mercer led the way down a staircase that was narrower than the main stairway, but better lit. Silas worked methodically. He checked the keel bolts with a calibrated torque wrench, then moved to the through-hull fittings and the rudder posts, measuring tolerance with a dial indicator he had brought from his shop. He inspected the stringers, the longitudinal supports that carried the hull's load, tapping them with a small brass hammer and listening to the note that returned. Captain Mercer watched this process with the controlled impatience of a man who had already performed these checks himself and found them satisfactory. He mentioned twice that the first guest would be arriving by tender in less than 3 hours. He mentioned once that the owner had already paid for the mooring through the following morning and that a delay would create complications with the harbor master. Silas did not respond to these statements. He simply moved from one inspection point to the next, recording his findings in a notebook with a pencil that he sharpened with a pocket knife when the point went soft. The bilge was the last compartment he inspected. It lay beneath the forward guest cabin, accessible through a hatch that required a stepladder. Silas descended with his penlight in his mouth and his brass hammer in his right hand. The bilge was dry, the pumps were clean, and the float switches moved freely. He swept the beam of his light across the hull interior, looking for discoloration, efflorescence, and the hairline marks that indicate stress. He found the mark near the forward bulkhead, partially hidden by a fresh coat of white paint that had been applied with a spray gun and a level of care that suggested haste rather than craftsmanship. It was a hairline no wider than a pencil lead, running horizontally across the hull interior at the point where the forward bulkhead met the hull plating. Silas photographed it with his phone. He measured its length with a steel rule. He placed the edge of the rule against the mark and sighted along it to see if it continued beyond the visible line. Then he tapped the surrounding hull. The sound was wrong. Not hollow exactly, because the hull was solid fiberglass, but not uniform either. The note returned with a dampened quality, as though the material was responding with a fraction of a second's hesitation. Silas had heard this sound before, on a structure that had struck a submerged container and on a sailboat dropped too hard by a travel lift. It was the sound of a structure that had been stressed in a way the surface did not reveal. He climbed out of the bilge and asked Captain Mercer for the manufacturer's repair records. The captain produced them from the folio he carried. The records were complete in every respect except one. They contained the original hull specification, the layup schedule, the resin batch numbers, and the certification from the yard that had built the vessel. They contained the dry dock survey from 6 months prior, and the insurance valuation, and the list of scheduled maintenance. What they did not contain was the stress mapping report for the forward hull section, the document that would show whether the area around the bulkhead had been subjected to load testing after the repairs that the captain had mentioned were performed 3 months ago. Captain Mercer said that the stress mapping was a standard formality on a vessel of this class, and that the absence of the document did not indicate an absence of compliance. Silas did not argue with him. He simply asked for a flashlight with a narrow beam and a chisel with a fine edge. The captain refused at first, stating that the owner's instructions did not authorize the removal of any finishes or fittings. Silas replied that without access to the surface beneath the paint, he couldn't sign the clearance. He said it the way a person states a fact they find neither satisfying nor entertaining. After a silence that lasted 11 seconds by Silas's uncounted estimate, Captain Mercer produced a utility light and a scraper from the crew's maintenance locker. Silas scraped away the fresh paint in a rectangle no larger than his outstretched hand. The paint came off in soft curls, revealing a surface that had been sanded before application, but not sanded evenly. Beneath the third layer of white, the hairline mark widened into a fracture that ran with geometric precision along the seam where the forward bulkhead met the hull plating. It was not a surface crack. It was a stress fracture, the kind that begins below the gel coat and travels through the laminate until it finds a plane of weakness. Silas measured its length with his steel rule. The horizontal run was 11 inches. He traced its path with the edge of the scraper, and he found that it dropped vertically at the forward end, descending toward the keel line in a path that followed the contour of the hull's load bearing member. The pattern was not random, it was structural. It indicated that the hull had flexed at this junction with a force sufficient to separate the laminate layers, and that the repair had addressed only the cosmetic surface while leaving the underlying damage intact. Elara Voss arrived on deck at 7:15. She descended to the bilge companionway in shoes that were not designed for ladder steps, and she stood in the cramped compartment with her arms folded while her captain explained what Silas had found. She looked at the exposed fracture for approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked at Silas. She saw inconvenience, a timeline collapsing, and a man with grease under his fingernails standing in the lowest compartment of her vessel. Silas saw failure. He saw a structure compromised by a repair protocol designed to pass visual inspection rather than restore integrity. He saw what would happen if this hull encountered a following sea at speed, if the bow buried in a trough and the hull flexed along the same plane where it had already failed once before. Elara increased the offer, doubling the original figure and then tripling it. She named a sum that would have purchased the building that housed Silas's shop, the equipment inside it, and the truck he drove to work, with enough remaining for Nora's education. She spoke the number the way she spoke every other fact that evening, as though it were simply a larger quantity of the same certainty. She did not ask what Silas intended to do. She told him what he was going to do. Silas set down the scraper. He explained that the fracture was not a repair item but a symptom. The hull had been flexing beyond its design tolerance, and the repair addressed only the gel coat surface. Under operational load, the stress that had created this fracture would reconcentrate at the same seam. The result would not be a leak but a structural failure at the bow, at speed with passengers aboard. He stated these things the way a person states a diagnosis they have confirmed with measurements. Elara's response was practical rather than emotional. She observed that every vessel afloat carried wear and that every captain made judgments about tolerance. She noted that the guests arriving by tender in 15 minutes were not interested in the molecular structure of fiberglass laminate, and that the money she had named would allow Silas to make whatever improvements to his shop he deemed necessary. She told him to sign the clearance, to let adults manage risk, and to consider what his daughter would think of a father who threw away security for a hairline in a bilge. Silas did not look at the fracture. He looked at Elara Voss. He told her that the yacht did not sail tonight, not with his name on the clearance. He did not raise his voice, and he did not repeat himself. He simply stated the fact, and then he climbed out of the bilge and walked back through the engine room to the service gangway, where the dock lights were coming on against a sky that had gone the color of wet slate. He did not hear what Elara said to her captain after he left. He did not need to. He had spent enough years reading the silence that follows a conversation when one person realizes that the other person is not going to bend. Silas returned to the shop at 8:45. Nora was asleep on the couch in the office. Her spelling worksheet finished on the desk beside her. She had used the word trust in a sentence about her father. The sentence read, "I trust my dad because he looks at things other people don't." Mrs. Carver had graded it with a red check mark and a sticker that Nora had already transferred to her lunchbox. The retaliation began the next morning at 9, when the telephone in the shop office rang with a caller ID that Silas didn't recognize. The voice on the other end identified himself as an inspector with the Harbor Safety Board, and he stated that a complaint had been filed regarding Silas's certification status. The complaint alleged that his most recent continuing education credits were not on file and that his surveyor's license was subject to a routine audit. The inspector assured Silas that this was a standard procedure and that there was no reason to be concerned if his records were in order. Silas's records were in order. He had filed his credits 3 weeks before the deadline, and he kept his certificates in a fireproof box beneath the desk where Nora did her homework. But he understood what the call was. By noon, his primary supplier had canceled his line of credit. The cancellation letter cited a routine review of customer counts and a decision to focus on higher volume clients. Silas had been purchasing from this supplier for 11 years and had never missed a payment. By 2 in the afternoon, a regular customer who ran a charter fishing operation called to say that he had been encouraged by a mutual acquaintance to take his seasonal maintenance to another shop. The acquaintance was not named, and the encouragement was described as friendly advice. Silas did not call Alara Voss, nor the harbor master, nor the supplier. He went back to work on the fishing boat that had been on the hard stand since Monday, replacing its through-hull fittings with the same thoroughness he applied to every job, even though the owner had made it clear that he could not afford the full rate and would pay half now and half in 2 weeks. Silas completed the work, accepted the partial payment, and wrote the balance in his ledger under a column he had labeled Open. Nora noticed that he was home more during the day. She asked why the phone wasn't ringing as often. Silas told her that some people didn't like the way he worked, and that they had decided to take their boats to other mechanics. He told her that this was their choice, and that his choice was to keep working the same way. Nora considered this while eating a peanut butter sandwich at the desk where she had watched Alara Voss make the offer 3 days before. Then she asked if the people who left would come back when they found out the other mechanics rushed past things. Silas told her that some would and some would not, and that either way he would still be here. The story broke in the local paper 10 days later, not because Silas had spoken to a reporter, but because a dock worker named Pete Yarrow had watched the Meridian Star sit idle at its mooring for 3 nights while mechanics from another firm were turned away at the gangway. Pete called a reporter he knew from the harbor beat, and the reporter called Silas. Silas described what he had found in the bilge, the fracture, the paint, and the missing stress mapping. He did not describe Alara Voss's offer, or the figure she had named, or Nora. The reporter wrote the story, and it ran on page 4 of the local section, beneath a photograph of the Meridian Star at its mooring. 3 days after the story ran, the telephone rang at 6 in the evening. The caller identified himself as David Chen, a marine engineer in Portland who had read the article online and recognized the hull number of the vessel. He asked Silas if the fracture had followed a particular path, horizontal and then vertical along the forward bulkhead seam. Silas confirmed that it had. David Chen said that he had seen this pattern before. Then he asked Silas if he knew what a composite layup void was, and he began to explain. David Chen worked for a firm that conducted failure analysis, and he had been following a thread for 18 months that he had not been able to pull fully into the light. The Meridian Star was built by a manufacturer that had introduced a new composite layup schedule 3 years prior, designed to reduce hull weight while maintaining structural ratings. The new schedule used a lighter core material between the fiberglass skins and adjusted the resin to fabric ratio in a way that saved approximately 800 pounds. The weight savings allowed the manufacturer to market improved fuel efficiency and higher cruising speeds. But the manufacturing process had left a void near the forward bulkhead on a specific production run beneath the inner skin of the laminate in the transition zone where hull curvature increased near the bow. Under normal operating conditions, the void did not cause problems, but when the hull encountered repeated stress from heavy seas or hard docking, the void allowed the inner and outer skins to flex independently. Over time, this created a stress concentration at the bulkhead seam, and the result was the exact pattern Silas had found, a horizontal fracture that turned vertical through the compromised laminate. David Chen sent Silas the internal memos he had obtained from a former quality control inspector. The memos dated back 14 months before the first hull launched. They described stress testing results that showed the forward hull section failing at 82% of its rated load. The engineering director had recommended a design revision. The production director had noted that the revision would delay delivery by 4 months and add $12,000 to the unit cost. The memos ended with a decision to proceed with the original schedule and address field issues under warranty. The warranty program had handled 3 other vessels from the same production run. In 2 cases, the owners had reported cosmetic gel coat cracking near the forward bulkhead. The manufacturer's authorized repair centers had sanded the surface, applied new gel coat, and certified the vessels without structural surveys. In the 3rd case, the owner had not reported any issue at all, and David Chen believed that vessel was still sailing. Silas read the memos twice, and then a 3rd time, not because he had missed anything, but because he needed to be certain that he had understood the full geometry of what he was holding. The crack he had found in the bilge of the Meridian Star was not an isolated failure. It was a signature, the physical evidence of a decision made in a conference room 14 months before the first hull touched water by people who had known the risk and calculated that the warranty program would cost less than the redesign. He testified before the Harbor Safety Board on a Thursday morning in a conference room that smelled of coffee and industrial carpet. He sat at a table with his notebook and his photographs, and he described what he had seen in the bilge, the fresh paint, the fracture beneath it, the sound the hull had made when he tapped it, and the missing stress mapping document. He did not mention Alara Voss by name, and he did not mention the offer she had made. But every person in the room understood who had pressured him and what he had refused to do. The board voted unanimously to ground the Meridian Star pending a full independent structural survey. The manufacturer issued a defensive statement affirming its commitment to safety. Alara Voss's legal team filed a motion challenging the board's jurisdiction, and then filed a second motion requesting that Silas's testimony be excluded on the grounds that he was not a credentialed naval architect. The motions were denied. The hull number was public by then, and other owners from the same production run had begun to call their own surveyors. The pattern was no longer hidden. 6 months later, the manufacturer settled a class action brought by owners of 17 vessels from the compromised production run. The terms were not disclosed, but the maritime press reported that the settlement included full hull replacements for 5 vessels and structural reinforcement for the remainder. The Meridian Star was hauled, stripped, and rebuilt by a yard that specialized in composite repair. Alara Voss sold the vessel 6 months after the work was completed to a charter company in San Diego, and the only trace of the previous history was a notation in the Coast Guard documentation. Silas's shop did not grow or shrink. It remained. The equipment loan that Alara had offered to clear was still being paid down in monthly installments that Silas calculated against his ledger every Friday evening. The linoleum in the kitchen on Mill Street was still lifting at the seams. Nora was 7 now, and on Saturday morning she helped Silas organize the tools on the pegboard wall, arranging the wrenches by size, with a precision that suggested she had been watching more carefully than he realized. What changed was the quality of the work that found him. Boat owners who had read the reports began to call from harbors 2 hours north and 3 hours south. They did not come because Silas was famous. They came because they needed someone who would look at what others had painted over. And they had learned that there was a mechanic in Barrow Harbor who did not know how to sign a form without meaning it. One evening in October, a new customer arrived without an appointment. He was an older man with a sailboat that needed a pre-purchase survey, and he had driven from a marina on the opposite coast because a friend had told him that Silas Warren was the man who found what nobody else was willing to look for. The man did not mention the Meridian Star, the fracture, the hearing, or the class action. He simply stood in the shop doorway with his hands in his pockets and described the boat he was considering and the doubt he had about its history and the particular need he had for someone who would tell him the truth, even if the truth cost the sale. Silas took the job. He did not charge more than the work was worth. He surveyed the sailboat on a Tuesday morning when the tide was low and the harbor light turned the water into a surface you could read like a chart. He tapped the hull 3 times in the same spot, and he listened. And he wrote his report with the same pencil, the same thoroughness, and the same standard that had cost him everything, and then given it back in a form he recognized. The door to the shop clicked shut behind the new customer, and Silas stood alone with his tool bag and the particular silence of a man who has never learned to bend. The world does not always reward the people who look closer, but it remembers them, and eventually, the ones who need that memory find their way to the right door. If you believe that integrity is the only standard that survives the sea, subscribe. This channel does not look away.